I am an expert wizard. I have spent the last 1,000 years mastering the arcane arts. You think you can stand against me?
I cast gun. So, fantasy tech levels. Something you might not think about consciously when engaging with fantasy stories, but something that informs a huge amount of the world building. In this video, we're going to explore the main tech level categories you might choose for your fantasy world and why. Before we get started, we just hit 100 subscribers. Considering almost all of you have come around just recently, I'm really happy with how things are going and I'm excited for this channel's future. Onward we go. So by my reckoning, there are 5 categories you can sort your fantasy world into. We'll start with a more formal term, and then one that you can use when somebody asks you what your world is, and you don't feel like spending an hour explaining it. So the formal categories are Antiquity, Medieval, Renaissance, Imperial, and Agnostic. These are best described in short as Romans, knights, funny hats, pike and shot, muskets, and whatever the hell I feel like. Of these, Medieval and Agnostic are by far the most common. Lord of the Rings and Skyrim are largely medieval, while D&D is generally agnostic. In my saying largely and generally, I'll also make it clear that these are not hard distinctions. You can mix them, and your world may be made more interesting if it's in a point of transition between one and another. This idea will be addressed a bit later on. Additionally, fantasy and modern worlds, which includes things like urban fantasy, does of course exist, but that sort of fantasy is strongly not my preference, so I'm not going to talk about something I'm not knowledgeable about and don't really like just for the sake of content. The last thing is that I'm mostly going to go over the broad strokes, what you should expect, what you might see on an aesthetic level, and what your limits will be. And remember, limits aren't always bad if you use them in interesting ways. So first up, Antiquity. This basically means from the Bronze Age up to about the 600s if we're talking real history, but we aren't. So here's what this actually means for your story, because Antiquity has a lot more to it than funny helmet crests. There are really about 4 essential differences between Antiquity and Medieval tech levels, so far as your world building is concerned. The first is that things like your cavalry are way lighter and less common. You don't really have anything like knights at this level, instead you've got chariots and such. If you've got people fighting on horses, it's usually to hurl stuff like javelins at their enemies. The second is that armor and weapons are just kind of worse. The metalworking isn't as good, and you don't have full suits of armor. I'm looking at you, For Honor Centurion. Many stories unfortunately treat all sorts of armor like paper anyway, but if it's something you want to consider, armor of Antiquity often has a lot more weak points than just an Achilles heel. The third is that any sort of ranged warfare is going to be way more limited, but also more impactful when it's used. Bows were not as advanced and less common relative to slingers and javelin throwers, so those latter two should be fairly common. Ballistae or even Greek fire can make appearances, and by the otherwise comparative lack of devastating ranged weaponry, their presence would be a pretty big deal in an Antiquity-esque story. The fourth is less concrete, but worth considering. Antiquity is pretty much always viewed through the lens of Rome on a societal level, and ultimately the most dynamic parts of Roman history are its rise, the advanced society it had during its peak, and then its fall. If your world is set in an Antiquity-like setting, it'll be worth considering if you want a Rome equivalent. If you don't, that's fine, but if you do, consider the implications of its state. Is it rising, creating a much more advanced society than before? Is it falling, with those advancements seeming like they may be lost? Antiquity is defined as being a period of advancement before the medieval Dark Ages, and this conception can be exploited for a lot of dramatic fun. Next is a classic, and that's Medieval. You've got your knights, your longbows, your trebuchets, your great helms, and feudalism. You don't need me to explain what a medieval tech level is, because if you clicked on this video, I'm sure you already know. And much of the fantasy you engage with is steeped in this tech level. It's simple, effective, and easy to understand all the way up to a societal level. Kingdoms are defined by their rulers and their royal houses, and though this isn't often thought of, nations, or countries as we think of them, are less of a thing. To use a good old protagonist von generic example, you thought he wasn't going to be in this video, didn't you? He would probably think of himself as a subject of the King of Kingia rather than a Kingian, so to speak. Over everything else, however, the main reason a medieval tech level might be right for you and why it works so well for so many settings is because it persists. Depending on how you want to define it, we were at a medieval tech level for about 1,000 years, from very roughly 500 to 1500, which is longer than all the other options save Antiquity, and that one's cheating because it's actually about 4 eras masquerading as one. Many medieval worlds have been so for thousands of years. Both the Elder Scrolls and A Song of Ice and Fire contain worlds that have remained at this tech level for a very long time before their stories start, and it seems like they'll stay that way even afterwards. This serves two purposes. The first is to just make it easier for everyone. Change in technology isn't a big theme, so neither the author nor the audience has to put much thought into that, allowing more focus to be put in other areas. The second is that it maintains the fantasy feel perhaps the best, and keeps that healthy distance from the real world that many of us enjoy about fantasy. You don't have to worry so much about how one day hobbits will be working at Waffle House to make ends meet. It also means you don't have to worry about an AK-47 outclassing your wizards one day. And while I play it for laughs, having this status quo really does have value to not be a burden on the audience's mind. Next up is my personal favorite, Renaissance. Halberds, pikes, the peak of plate armor, and finally the beginnings of real commonplace gunpowder warfare. Especially in larger worlds, I find that a Renaissance tech level can be an excellent way to have factions with stark differences. As was the case during our real-life Renaissance and the years that followed, nations with starkly different levels of advancement came into conflict regularly. Warhammer Fantasy is an excellent example here. The main subset of humanity and the dwarves have gunpowder weaponry, even up to steampunk levels with the dwarves in certain parts of the Empire, while certain factions like the elves remain essentially medieval, with their mastery of magic keeping them on a level playing field with the others. This kind of disparity is what I'd say is the Renaissance's best strength. It gives all sorts of ways for different groups to keep up with each other. It also offers a healthy alternative to medieval stagnancy if that happens to not be your thing. The idea of a Renaissance also carries with it the wind of change. This change doesn't have to be fast, but at this tech level it probably should be at least somewhat present. Say that the world protagonist von Generic inhabits is a Renaissance-level world. This change could be expressed as the evolution of muskets from matchlock to wheel-lock to flintlock. It could mean the emergence of steampunk technology as well if you want more advanced things without committing to actual modern technology, and losing some of that fantasy feeling. The Imperial tech level, as I'm calling it, is easily the least common of all the ones mentioned so far, and that is for a fair reason. Fantasy often calls for magic, and regardless of what type of magic you have, it can be difficult to reconcile with massed ranks of foot soldiers firing musket volleys at each other. Either the magic is powerful enough to absolutely decimate any such formation, or lacking power such that any attempted mage would become about 50% lead before being able to cast anything at all. Earnestly, one of the best examples I can come up with that may be known to your lay person is Pirates of the Caribbean. It fits all the criteria save for the fact that it does nominally take place in our world. However, its existence does prove that there's room for 18th century themed fantasy, especially if it's on the high seas. It definitely is a challenge though. By and large, armor isn't useful anymore, and any characters you have will need to reckon with the abundance of gunpowder weaponry. However, honorable duels, be they with pistol or blade, are a good staple and well suited to this tech level. A pirate sort of theme is a great start as well, but sort of like the Antiquity option, this tech level comes with some preconceptions from the real world. The first is that this era was the peak of colonization in real life and the beginning of global trade, which we'll just say can be difficult to work with if you want to address those themes. The second is that getting this far advanced heavily implies the continued movement of technology into our current modernity. Once you get here more strongly than the other settings, the Hobbit Waffle House scenario feels more and more inevitable. You can work around it, but it is something you'll have to address one way or the other. That's to say it's easy to buy medieval or pike and shot type warfare lasting essentially forever, but it's a little harder to buy when it comes to any form of exclusively gunpowder based combat, because intuitively we think, surely they're going to come up with some better way to fight each other than, standing in fields facing each other in lines. Before we get to our final category of agnostic, we'll do that promised addressing of tech level mixing. The main idea here is that if your world is going to go through a time of great change or social upheaval, like a revolution, a civil war, or any other such thing, tech level mixing can be an excellent way to add to that. The fall of an empire can lead you from antiquity to medieval, rapid expansion of culture, technology, and philosophy, even the buildup of religious tension, can take you from medieval to Renaissance, and then the consolidation of power into absolute rulers can be your common course from Renaissance into Imperial. Having these changes in technology could be very useful to your world and will necessarily focus the audience on whatever place in that world is seeing the technological growth. Is it the antagonist's evil empire that's advancing, or perhaps is it the hero's own land going through a time of rapid advancement? Either could be interesting, so it's for this reason I think tech level mixing could be a useful tool in the toolbox. Finally, we get to tech level agnosticism. This is one of the easiest to explain, but it's also the most different from the other categories. The world of Forgotten Realms, where a large amount of Dungeons & Dragons campaigns take place, is a tech-level agnostic world. Pretty much all historical aesthetics exist somewhere, and technology levels vary wildly depending on what part of that world you go to. The world of Protagonist Von Generic is of course also agnostic, because Protagonist's world is at the whims of whatever I need for these videos. Not really keeping track of nor defining your world by tech levels has a lot of unique benefits, but they have matching challenges as well. The first is that you can do almost anything you want. Mix Roman aesthetics with Renaissance weaponry and Imperial naval ships. Whatever suits you can work. However, with all of these options comes a greater difficulty in maintaining believability if the differences become too stark, though balancing things out with magic is always a solid option. You also tend to see tech-agnostic settings are less serious overall. Forgotten Realms is sort of a silly world, and that isn't a bad thing, but it's very different in tone to, say, a Song of Ice and Fire. This is obviously related to the believability aspect. Agnostic settings don't make quite as much logical sense, so keeping a less serious vibe throughout the world will likely feel better overall. Tech agnosticism also can work pretty well for worlds that are particularly large, where perhaps the massive technology differences can be explained by the vast distances between different civilizations, or how foreign they may be to one another. The challenge here is that your world might then lose its own unique aesthetic. If there isn't much of a common feeling between the different places in your world, it may feel like several worlds stitched together rather than one cohesive entity. Overall, tech agnosticism gives you a ton of options. You have to be thoughtful to get everything to feel cohesive, but when done right, it can be very fun. So with that, we've more or less covered the basics of fantasy tech levels. Hopefully this video has offered you a new way to think about your own world, or opened up some options you may not have realized you had. Anyways, thank you so much for watching this video, and if you enjoyed it, consider liking and subscribing. So thank you for taking a chance on a small channel, and remember, when facing rogue wizards, cast gun.